A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Alright, we have a fascinating one today. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the intersection of ADHD medication and respiratory health. He noticed that taking Vyvanse seems to relieve his asthma symptoms, specifically chest tightness, much like caffeine does. He's asking what the connection is between a focused medication and breathing.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Daniel, you're absolutely tapping into some very deep pharmacological history and physiology with this observation. You aren't imagining it at all. In fact, what you're describing is a textbook example of how sympathetic nervous system activation affects the body, but it's a connection that most people today have completely forgotten because we've become so specialized in how we prescribe medicine.
It is funny because when you think of Vyvanse, you think of brains, sitting still, and getting work done. You don't usually think of lungs or opening up the airways. By the way, before we dive into the weeds, just a quick shout out to Google Gemini 3 Flash for powering our script today. It's helping us navigate this intersection of neurochemistry and pulmonology. So, Herman, let's start with the basics. Why would a stimulant meant for the prefrontal cortex have anything to do with Daniel's lungs?
It comes down to the fact that Vyvanse, or lisdexamfetamine, amphetamine, is a sympathomimetic. That's a fancy way of saying it mimics the sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight response. When your body thinks it needs to run from a predator or hunt for food, it doesn't just sharpen your focus, it prepares your entire physical infrastructure for high performance. One of the most critical parts of that preparation is making sure you can get as much oxygen into your bloodstream as possible.
Right? Because if you're running for your life, you don't want your airways to be narrow. You need a massive intake of air.
Precisely. Well, I shouldn't say precisely, but that is the mechanical reality. When Vyvanse enters your system, it's a prodrug, so it converts into dextroamphetamine in your red blood cells. That dextroamphetamine then triggers a significant release of norepinephrine and dopamine. While we talk about dopamine for the reward and focus side of ADHD, it's the norepinephrine that's doing the heavy lifting for your lungs. Norepinephrine acts on what we call beta-2 adrenergic receptors. These receptors are located all over the smooth muscle of your bronchioles, the small tubes in your lungs. When norepinephrine hits those receptors, it tells the muscle to relax. And when the muscle relaxes, the airway expands. That is bronchodilation.
So Daniel is essentially getting a systemic dose of a bronchodilator every time he takes his ADHD meds. It's like a very slow release, internal version of a rescue inhaler.
In a sense, yes. If you look at a rescue inhaler like albuterol, its entire job is to be a selective beta-2 agonist. It goes straight to those same receptors in the lungs and flips the switch to open. The difference is that albuterol is designed to stay mostly in the lungs to avoid systemic side effects, whereas the norepinephrine triggered by Vyvanse is circulating everywhere. It's hitting your heart, your blood vessels, and yes, your lungs.
I find it wild that we use these drugs for such different things now. But Daniel mentioned caffeine too. I know a lot of people with asthma who swear by a strong cup of black coffee when they feel tight. Is that the same mechanism?
It's a cousin to the mechanism. Caffeine is an adenosine antagonist, and it also inhibits an enzyme called phosphodiesterase. This leads to a similar relaxation of the bronchial smooth muscle. In fact, caffeine is chemically very similar to a drug called theophylline, which was a primary asthma treatment for decades. If you go back 40 or 50 years, doctors would actually tell asthma patients to drink coffee if they didn't have their meds handy. So Daniel is noticing a very real pharmacological pattern here.
It makes me wonder about the history of this. If these stimulants are so good at opening airways, were they ever actually marketed for that? Or did we just stumble into the ADHD use later?
Oh, it's the opposite. Amphetamines were originally respiratory drugs. In 1933, the very first amphetamine product on the market was the Benzedrine inhaler. You could walk into a pharmacy and buy it over the counter. It wasn't for focus, it was for nasal congestion and asthma. People would sniff the vapors to shrink the swelling in their nose and open their lungs.
Wait, you could just buy an amphetamine inhaler over the counter? That sounds like a recipe for a very productive, yet very jittery 1930s.
It was. People eventually figured out that if you cracked the inhaler open and ate the cotton strip inside, you got a massive systemic high. That's actually how the abuse potential of amphetamines was first discovered. But the medical reason they moved away from using them for asthma wasn't just the potential for abuse. It was the side effects that Daniel might be feeling alongside the easy breathing, the increased heart rate and higher blood pressure.
Right, because if I just want to breathe better, I don't necessarily want my heart racing at 100 beats per minute while I'm sitting on the couch.
That's why modern medicine moved towards selective drugs. We wanted the bronchodilation of the amphetamine without the systemic revving up of the whole body. Albuterol was a massive breakthrough because it targeted the lungs specifically. But when you take Vyvanse for ADHD, you're taking a systemic drug. You're getting the whole package, and for someone with asthma, that package includes a side effect of easier breathing.
It's like buying a heavy-duty truck because you need the towing capacity, but then realizing it also cleared the snow off your driveway just by driving over it. It wasn't the primary goal, but it's a nice perk. But I have to ask, is this actually safe? If Daniel has asthma and he's taking Vyvanse, and maybe he also has a rescue inhaler, isn't he double dipping on the stimulants?
That is the big red flag here. This is where we need to talk about heart strain. Both Vyvanse and rescue inhalers like albuterol are pushing the body in the same direction. They both stimulate the cardiovascular system. If you take your Vyvanse and then you have an asthma flare-up and hit your albuterol inhaler, you are stacking those effects. You can end up with tachycardia, which is a dangerously fast heart rate, or even arrhythmias.
So it's not just, oh, cool, my meds help me breathe. It's my meds are changing the baseline of how my heart and lungs interact. Does this mean someone could potentially mask a serious asthma attack because the Vyvanse is keeping them just open, enough to not realize how much inflammation is actually in their lungs?
That is a very real risk. Asthma isn't just about the muscle constriction, it's also about inflammation. Vyvanse helps with the constriction, the tightening of the tubes, but it does nothing for the underlying inflammation. If Daniel relies on the open feeling from his Vyvanse, he might ignore the fact that his lungs are actually becoming more inflamed and sensitive. It's like taking a painkiller for a broken leg and then trying to run on it. You can't feel the pain as much, but the damage is still there and potentially getting worse.
That's a sobering thought. I want to dig more into the neurochemistry of this, specifically the norepinephrine side. You mentioned it hits the beta-2 receptors, but doesn't norepinephrine also affect the vagus nerve or the parasympathetic system? I've heard that the balance between the fight or flight and rest and digest systems is what actually controls our breath.
You've hit on a really important layer. Our lungs are controlled by a constant tug of war. The sympathetic system wants to open them up, and the parasympathetic system, controlled largely by the vagus nerve, wants to constrict them. In a healthy person, this balance is perfect. In someone with asthma, the parasympathetic side is often too loud. It's overreacting to triggers like pollen or cold air and slamming the doors shut.
So by upping the norepinephrine with Vyvanse, Daniel is essentially shouting over the parasympathetic system. He's shifting the balance back toward the sympathetic side.
And there's also a central nervous system component. Stimulants change how we perceive effort and discomfort. There is some evidence that stimulants can increase your ventilatory drive, making your brain tell your body to breathe more efficiently. But they also reduce the subjective feeling of breathlessness. So even if his lung function stayed exactly the same, the dopamine and norepinephrine might just make him care less about the tightness. It lowers the alarm bells in the brain.
That sounds like a double-edged sword. If I'm an athlete, maybe I want that. But if I'm an asthmatic, those alarm bells are there for a reason. They tell me when I need to get to a doctor or use my steroid inhaler.
And there's another layer to the anxiety piece. We know that ADHD and anxiety often go hand in hand. Anxiety itself causes chest tightness and shallow breathing. For some people, Vyvanse actually reduces their background anxiety by making them feel more in control and less overwhelmed. If Daniel's asthma symptoms are sometimes exacerbated by anxiety-induced chest tightness, the Vyvanse might be treating the asthma by actually treating the anxiety.
That's a fascinating circle. So it's not just a physical opening of the tubes, it could be a psychological loosening of the chest. But I've also heard the opposite happens. Don't some people get more short of breath on stimulants because they get stuck in a high arousal state?
Yes, and that's the individual variability we have to account for. For some people, the dose of Vyvanse is high enough that it triggers a pseudodyspnea. They become so hyper-aware of their breathing that they start to feel like they aren't getting enough air even though their lungs are wide open. They might start over-breathing or sighing a lot. It's a very fine line between therapeutic bronchodilation and stimulant-induced breathing anxiety.
It's like the Goldilocks zone of breathing. You want just enough stimulation to keep the airways open, but not so much that you're hyperventilating or having a panic attack. I wonder, does the body get used to this? If Daniel takes Vyvanse every day, do his lungs eventually stop responding to that open feeling?
That's a process called downregulation, and it is a concern. Our receptors aren't static. If they are constantly being flooded with a signal, in this case norepinephrine, they might start to pull back and become less sensitive. This is a known issue with long-term use of certain asthma medications. If your beta-2 receptors become less sensitive because of your ADHD meds, there's a theoretical risk that your rescue inhaler might not work as effectively when you really need it during a crisis.
That is definitely something to discuss with a doctor. It seems like the coordination between a psychiatrist and a pulmonologist is actually pretty vital here, even though they usually work in completely different buildings.
It's a classic example of why we can't treat the body as a collection of separate parts. The brain and the lungs are talking to each other through the same chemical language. If you change the levels of a neurotransmitter to help someone focus on a spreadsheet, you are changing the levels of a hormone that tells their lungs how to behave.
You know, what's interesting is that this isn't just a Daniel thing. There are millions of people with ADHD who also have asthma. I saw a study recently suggesting a significant genetic overlap between the two conditions. It makes me wonder if we're missing a broader treatment strategy here. Could there be a future where we design ADHD meds that are even more lung-friendly, or asthma meds that help with focus?
It's an area of active research. There's a lot of interest in how the immune system and the nervous system interact. Some researchers think that the chronic low-grade inflammation in asthma might actually contribute to the cognitive symptoms we associate with ADHD. If that's the case, then a drug that addresses both, like a sympathomimetic, is hitting two birds with one stone. But as we discussed, the cardiovascular cost is currently the limiting factor.
Let's talk about the practical side for a second. If Daniel is noticing this, what should he actually do with this information? I mean, it's a cool aha moment, but it also sounds like he needs to be careful.
The first thing is data. If I were Daniel, I would start keeping a simple log. Note when you take your Vyvanse, and then rate your breathing or chest tightness a few times throughout the day. You want to see if there's a clear correlation. Does the open feeling peak when the Vyvanse peaks? Does it go away in the evening when the drug wears off? This kind of data is gold for a doctor.
And he should definitely talk to his doctor about the masking effect we mentioned. If he's feeling great because of the Vyvanse, he needs to make sure his underlying asthma management, like his maintenance steroid inhaler, is still doing its job. You don't want to be faking good lung health with stimulants while inflammation builds up in the background.
And the cardiovascular piece is huge. If he's using both an ADHD med and an asthma med, he should probably be monitoring his heart rate and blood pressure at home. It's easy to do now with a simple cuff or even a smartwatch. If he notices his resting heart rate is creeping up 10 or 15 beats higher than it used to be, that's a sign that the stacked effect is putting stress on his system.
It's also worth mentioning the rebound effect. If Vyvanse is helping him breathe during the day, does he get more congested or tighter at night when it wears off? Some people experience a stimulant crash that includes physical symptoms like nasal congestion or a feeling of heaviness in the chest.
That's a very common phenomenon. It's essentially the sympathetic system letting go and the parasympathetic system overcompensating. It's like a pendulum swinging back. If he finds he's having asthma symptoms, specifically in the evening as the Vyvanse leaves his system, that's a huge clue that the drug was providing a significant bronchodilatory support that his body is now missing.
Which could lead to someone wanting to take another dose just to breathe, and that's where you get into the dangerous territory of misuse. It's so important to recognize that this is a side effect, not the intended use.
And we should mention the caffeine piece again. Daniel noted that caffeine feels similar. If he's taking Vyvanse and drinking 3 cups of coffee and using an inhaler, he is basically running a pharmacological marathon every single day. Caffeine and amphetamines have a synergistic effect. They don't just add up, they multiply each other's impact on the heart and lungs.
I've been that person. Vyvanse plus 2 espressos makes me feel like I can see through time, but I also feel like my heart is trying to escape through my ribs. It's not a sustainable state.
It's really not. For someone with asthma, that extra stimulation might make the breathing feel effortless, but at what cost to the rest of the plumbing? The goal of medicine is always the minimum effective dose with the minimum systemic impact. Daniel's observation is a great reminder of why we have to be so precise.
You know, this whole conversation reminds me of how far we've come from the Benzedrine inhaler days. We used to just throw these powerful chemicals at whatever problem we had. Lungs tight? Here, have some speed. Now we're much more surgical, but Daniel's experience shows that the old effects are still there, lurking in the background of our modern meds.
It's the ghost in the machine. The pharmacology of the 1930s is still inside the Vyvanse molecule of 2026. We've just wrapped it in a pro-drug delivery system to make it safer and more consistent for the brain. But the lungs don't care about the delivery system, they just care about the norepinephrine.
So, to wrap this part up, Daniel isn't crazy. Vyvanse is a direct descendant of original asthma medications. It releases norepinephrine, which physically relaxes the muscles in his lungs. It also potentially lowers his anxiety and changes his perception of breathing effort. But it comes with a risk of masking underlying inflammation and putting extra strain on his heart, especially if he's mixing it with caffeine or other asthma meds.
That's a perfect summary. It's a fascinating physiological quirk that highlights just how connected our internal systems are. If you're changing the weather in the brain, you're going to get some rain, or in this case, some sunshine in the lungs.
I love that. Changing the weather in the brain. So what are the big takeaways for Daniel or anyone else who's noticed this?
Number 1, track it. Don't just rely on a vague feeling. Use a journal or an app to see if the breathing relief follows the timeline of the medication. This will help your doctor figure out if the effect is purely pharmacological or if there's an anxiety component.
Number 2, don't self-medicate your asthma with ADHD meds. If you're feeling tight, don't think, oh, I'll just take my Vyvanse an hour early. That's a dangerous game. Your asthma needs its own dedicated management plan that addresses inflammation, not just the quick fix of bronchodilation.
Number 3, coordinate your care. Make sure your psychiatrist knows you have asthma and make sure your pulmonologist knows you're on a high-dose stimulant. They need to be watching your cardiovascular health together.
And number 4, watch the caffeine. If you're already getting bronchodilation from your Vyvanse, you might not need that 3rd cup of coffee. In fact, cutting back on caffeine might actually make your breathing feel more natural and less forced by reducing that jittery hyper-awareness.
And I'd add a 5th, learn some breathing techniques. Since stimulants can make you hyper-focused on your breath, having a structured way to breathe, like box breathing or diaphragmatic breathing, can help you manage that pseudodyspnea if it ever pops up. It gives your brain a job to do that's actually productive for your lungs.
That's solid advice. It's about taking the biological gift of the medication, but being smart enough not to let it bite you. It's a weird intersection, but that's why we're here.
It really is. It's also worth mentioning that research into selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors for ADHD, like atomoxetine, shows similar effects on the lungs but without the same kick as a stimulant. It just goes to show that the norepinephrine-lung connection is a very robust piece of human biology.
It makes me think about how many other side effects we just ignore because we aren't paying attention. Daniel was observant enough to notice the breathing, but what else is the Vyvanse doing? Is it changing his digestion, his skin temperature, his peripheral vision? Once you realize one system is being affected, you start looking at everything.
That's the rabbit hole of pharmacology. Every drug is a systemic intervention, no matter how much we want it to be a targeted one. We're essentially dropping a pebble into a pond and watching the ripples reach every shore.
Well, Daniel, thanks for the prompt. You've given us a great excuse to look at the history of speed as a cold medicine and the amazing way our lungs respond to the fight-or-flight signal. It's a great reminder that even when we're just sitting at a desk trying to focus, our bodies are capable of some pretty intense physical shifts.
And it's a great example of why we do this show. Taking a simple observation, I breathe better on my ADHD meds, and realizing it connects back to the 1930s and the fundamental tug of war between our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems.
Before we go, I want to ask one more thing. We talked about how these drugs were marketed as inhalers. Do you think we'll ever go back to that? Like, could there be a microdose stimulant inhaler for people who just need a 10-minute focus boost without the 12-hour commitment of a pill?
It's a wild idea, but probably not. The abuse potential and the hit from inhalation are just too high. When you inhale a drug, it goes from your lungs to your brain in seconds. That's why we have things like crack versus cocaine. The delivery speed changes the addiction profile completely. Modern medicine is moving towards slow and steady, which is why Vyvanse is a prodrug. It's designed to be impossible to rush.
Right, you can't snort it, you can't inject it to get a rush, because your red blood cells have to process it first. It's built-in safety. I guess focus inhalers will have to stay in the realm of science fiction for now.
Probably for the best. We have enough trouble with people over-caffeinating as it is. We don't need pocket focus sticks that hit the brain in 3 seconds.
Fair point. Alright, I think we've covered the why and the how and the be careful for Daniel. This was a fun one.
It really was. Thanks for the prompt, Daniel. It's always good to dig into the weird ways our meds work.
This has been My Weird Prompts. Big thanks to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to dive deep into these topics every week.
If you enjoyed this dive into the neurochemistry of breathing, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. It really helps other curious minds find the show.
You can find all our episodes and join the conversation at myweirdprompts.com. We're also on Telegram. Just search for My Weird Prompts to get notified whenever a new episode drops.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with another prompt.
Stay curious and watch your heart rate. See ya.
Rely.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.